Welcome to chapter 19 as we start quite a few chapters looking overall at the cardiovascular system and starting with the blood. So first of all, what are the functions of the blood? And a lot of these are rather intuitive and things you've probably covered before. But number one, transporting things, and this includes multiple things. The blood transports a lot: gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients like glucose, also gets rid of waste products from our cells, processed molecules. So as we go through metabolism and our body's breaking things down or making things, regulatory molecules like different hormones. So again, lots of things moving through the blood. In addition to that, though, the blood is also important in regulating pH, so it has a buffer system in it. It's important in osmosis, so maintaining proper water inside cells and inside the blood. Regulating body temperature, so we think about blood rushing to our face, to the surface to lower the body temperature, or constricting to maintain it. It also is involved in the immune system as far as it's where our antibodies are going to be moving, looking for foreign substances or detecting them. And also clotting, so whenever we have an injury, the blood is an important part there for clotting to allow tissue repair to occur and also to stop blood loss. So what is the blood made up of? So first of all, it's one of our connective tissues. So again, we have epithelial tissues and all that, but blood is a type of connective tissue, but it has a liquid matrix with cells and fragments. So the liquid part is called the plasma. That's a little more than half of the overall blood volume is that liquid part. And then it has a lot of formed elements that we'll be talking about. So these are the cells and cell fragments, and that makes up the remainder, so a little less than half of the blood. So just looking at some averages here. So females have about 4 to 5 liters. Males have a little bit more with 5 to 6 liters of blood overall. So again, just looking at that breakdown. So again, plasma, the liquid part is about 55%, a little more than half. And then those formed elements, a little bit less than half. And those formed elements, the majority of that is going to be red blood cells. Then we have multiple types of white blood cells. And then we also have those fragments, which are platelets. Now within the plasma, we have a few different things. Most of it is water. So of that 55%, the majority of that is water, but there are also some various proteins found in the blood that include things like albumins, globulins, and fibrogen that's important in clotting. And then just some other solutes, again, think about that transporting things that are soluble like ions, nutrients, that waste or gases, those regulatory substances, those are dissolved inside of that plasma. So if we look a little bit more at each part, so the plasma, again, that liquid part, the majority of the blood, it is a colloid, which is a liquid that's containing suspended substances that don't settle out. So it's in solution. But again, those are some of those plasma proteins, again, like the albumin. So they're things that are dissolved in the water. Again, majority of it, though, is water, with the remainder being those proteins, ions, nutrients, things we just mentioned in the last slide. And that composition remains relatively constant throughout homeostasis, even though the materials are constantly moving in and out of the blood. It's overall relatively, kept the same as part of that homeostasis. Now, what about these proteins that are found in there? Again, we mentioned the albumins. This is the majority, about 58% of the proteins that are found in the plasma are albumins. It's important for the viscosity, so giving it some thickness helps regulate that osmotic pressure. So thinking about water moving in and out, so maintaining that. Helps with buffering, also transports fatty acids, bilirubin, and thyroid hormones. Again, thinking about that transport function. Globulins, these are involved in transporting lots of different substances. It's involved in our immune system, and there are 3 different types. So there are alpha, beta, and gamma globulins, and that makes up about 38% of the proteins. And then the smallest fraction of plasma proteins is fibrinogen, and this is important in that blood clotting. So the serum is plasma without the clotting factors. So if you're taking blood serum, again, those clotting factors have been removed so that it doesn't clot. All right, now what about some of the other parts in the plasma? So again, we have things that are dissolved. So again, we have the proteins, but we also have dissolved solutes. So those include ions. So think about like sodium and potassium, calcium. Those are important for maintaining, again, osmosis and the movement of water, but also our membrane potentials when we think about muscle contraction, and also acid-base balance. So thinking about pH. Lots of different nutrients like glucose, amino acids, our fats, vitamins, lots of different waste products as the liver is breaking down, especially amino acids and proteins. We produce urea and uric acid, creatine, ammonia salts. Those are all from the breakdown of proteins. That needs to be removed from the body by dissolving into the blood and then ultimately out through the kidneys. Bilirubin is really important in breaking down the product of red blood cells. Lactic acid, that's when anaerobic respiration, when we run out of oxygen and we need to switch to fermentation, we produce that lactic acid that's a waste. We need to get rid of that so our muscles don't get real sore and we don't mess up that acid-base balance. Lots of different gases like our oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also some nitrogen in there as well. And then our hormones and enzymes as far as regulatory substances. Now, what about the formed elements? So this is the 45%. So the plasma is 55%, formed elements is the 45%. So of those formed elements, red blood cells make up the most of it. Those are called erythrocytes. It's about 95% of those formed elements. So again, the majority of formed elements, mainly red blood cells. Then we have our white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes. And white blood cells are divided into granulocytes and agranulocytes. This is talking about granules that are found inside. So if we look at them under the microscope, granulocytes produce granules that you can see. They look grainy. Agranulocytes do not. So again, they have, the cytoplasm has those large granules. They can also have multiple nuclei that are in there. There are 3 of these: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. So those all make up granulocytes. Then the agranulocytes, again, they don't have those. And then they also don't have lobed nuclei, meaning they don't have multiple, or they're not like budding out. And the 2 of those are lymphocytes and monocytes. So neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils are all granulocytes. Maybe come up with some kind of mnemonic to help you with that. Agranulocytes are the lymphocytes and monocytes. And then the last part of our formed elements are the platelets that are also called thrombocytes. Now these are cell fragments. And these help to form the platelet plug that's going to be important for blood clotting. Just looking at some of these, again, our red blood cells, kind of this nice little donut shape. They don't have nuclei in them. They have a nice little concave shape here. Our white blood cells, though, kind of a more typical cell, they do have a nucleus that are in there. And then we have these little protein fragments that are shown here. Those are going to help with that clotting. All right, so then how do we actually make these? So the production of red blood cells is called hematopoiesis. And this is the production of blood cells, especially, again, those red blood cells. So infants, this occurs in that yolk sac of the embryo, also in the liver, the thymus, spleen, lymph nodes, and red bone marrow is where the production of these formed elements, these blood cells, is occurring. Then after birth, it all moves to the red bone marrow and the lymphatic tissue. Now the red bone marrow in the adults is in the ribs, the sternum, the vertebrae, the pelvis, the femur, and the humerus. All right, so these are formed from what are called stem cells. So stem cells give rise to all cells in the body. So they're formed elements that are derived from a particular type of stem cells called hematocytoblast. So these are stem cells that can give rise to all the blood cells. So again, stem cells can become anything. They start to differentiate. So hemocytoblasts can give rise to any of the blood cells, any of these formed elements. Whenever they divide, one of the daughter cells remains a stem cell that can become anything, and the other one is going to differentiate. It either becomes a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. So it has 2 choices. The myeloid become either pro-erythroblast And from that name, pro meaning before, erythro, we think about erythrocytes. Those are going to develop into red blood cells. Myeloblasts, those become the basophils, neutrophils, and eosinophils. If you remember, those are going to be our granulocytes. Monoblasts become monocytes, so that's kind of easy. And then megakaryoblast, those are going to become the platelets. Now, the lymphoid stem cells become the lymphoblasts, and those are going to become those lymphocytes. So again, this is just kind of thinking about kind of a flow chart here. Again, stem cells can become anything. They differentiate into hemocytoblasts. From there, they either become myeloid or lymph stem cells. The lymphoids only develop into lymphocytes. The myeloid, though, divide into proerythroblasts to become red blood cells, myeloblasts to become the granulocytes, monoblasts to become monocytes, and megakaryoblast to become platelets. So here's a nice little kind of summary flow chart so that we can see that a little bit more visual. Again, those hematocytoblasts become either the myeloid or the lymphoid stem cells. Lymphoid only become lymphoblasts to become lymphocytes, one of our agranulocytes. Then the myeloid and the proerythroblast ultimately become the red blood cells. Megakaryoblast become the platelets. The myoblasts ultimately become the myeloblasts, become the basophils, eosinophils, or neutrophils, those granulocytes, and then the monoblasts become the monocytes. Now our other part here, so what signals all of this? So there's a chemical signal called colony stimulating factors. These regulate the development. So again, how does that hemocytoblast know whether to become myeloid or lymphoid? And then if it's myeloid, does it become a monoblast, or what does it do? So there are different signals that are happening, and some of those are called colony stimulating factors. Another way is by hormones, so erythropoietin, EPO, this is a hormone that gets released, and that's going to stimulate the red blood cell development. So it's going to trigger that pathway to those red blood cells. So that erythropoietin is what's going to trigger that. Now our red blood cells, just a little bit more about them. We already kind of mentioned they have this nice little disc kind of shape, no nucleus in those red blood cells. Again, flexible, capable of bending and flowing, so they can go through lots of different blood vessels, no matter how small. They have hemoglobin, which is going to help carry that oxygen, but they also have lipids, energy, their ATP, and carbonic anhydrase, as we'll see, is going to help with that pH. Now, what are the functions? Again, mainly with that hemoglobin, they're transporting oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. The majority of that is attached to that hemoglobin, but some can be dissolved in the plasma as well, but most of it's transported by hemoglobin. Then the carbon dioxide gets transported as a waste from the tissues to the lungs after aerobic respiration. So some of that is dissolved into the plasma, but also about a quarter of it is combined with hemoglobin. So it mainly transports oxygen, but can transport carbon dioxide. But the majority of it, about 70%, travels as a molecule called bicarbonate. And that's the result of combining water and carbon dioxide using that enzyme carbonic anhydrase that we just mentioned. So again, red blood cells have that enzyme. So it takes in that carbon dioxide and makes carbonic anhydrase. And this is also going to be important in maintaining pH. So a little bit more about hemoglobin. Again, it's carrying that oxygen, but also some carbon dioxide. It has 4 subunits, so it's one big protein made up of 4 smaller polypeptides or smaller proteins. Each polypeptide is called a globin. So those have heme groups, and heme is the iron, so it gives that red pigment. And each heme contains 1 iron atom. And there are 3 different types of the hemoglobin. So there's embryonic or fetal. They have a greater attraction for oxygen than the adult. But they are going to stop production after birth. So hence the name embryonic or fetal. They're only produced during development. After birth, there are 3 different types in the adult. So oxyhemoglobin, so that iron and the hemoglobin binds to oxygen. So we have 4 molecules of hemoglobin, and that's what gives that bright red color. So each one can carry 4 oxygen. We have deoxyhemoglobin. This is hemoglobin not bound to oxygen, so it's going to be a real dark red color. So if it has a bright red color, it means it's oxygenated. If it's not oxygenated, it's a darker red. Then we also have carbaminohemoglobin. So this is the globin of hemoglobin is bound to carbon dioxide. So remember, it can carry mainly oxygen, but also some carbon dioxide. So when it's carrying that, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. This is just showing what it looks like. Again, we have these 4 protein subunits, each one called a polypeptide. So 4 of them combine to make up 1 hemoglobin molecule. Each one has this heme group shown here as this little blue dot, and then it's magnified over here to show this iron atom here in the middle, but each one of these carries 1 oxygen. So each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen atoms. Again, it gives it that nice bright red color that we see when it's oxygenated. So a little life history here, day in the life of a red blood cell. So we have erythropoiesis. This is the formation of those red blood cells. It takes about 4 days overall. And if we kind of go back, so that again, we have those hematocytes or blasts that can become any of the red blood cell or any of the blood cells. Again, they differentiate into the myeloid stem cells. They then become pro-erythroblasts, again, meaning before the erythroblasts. Then we have early erythroblasts, intermediate, late. Then we have reticulocytes. These are once they're released into the blood, and then ultimately the erythrocytes. What kind of triggers all of this, again, is that hormone erythropoietin that stimulates that red blood cell production. It's produced there in the kidneys in response to low oxygen. So hypoxia is when oxygen levels are low. So that hormone gets released to increase our red blood cells. So they last about 110 to 120 days in circulation. When they rupture, it's called hemolysis. And then that hemoglobin gets broken down by macrophages, part of our immune system, that's going to destroy those when they're done. So just kind of looking here at that, summarizing that red blood cell. So again, hypoxia, that low blood level, that's going to be detected by the kidneys. The kidney responds by increasing the release of erythropoietin, that hormone that stimulates increased red blood cell production. Then as the blood cell number increases, the ability to transport oxygen increases, allowing more oxygen to be delivered. Conversely, though, as the blood oxygen gets too high, then less erythropoietin gets released, and then red blood cell production is going to decrease. So we have that feedback loop that is all centered around that erythropoietin. If we need more red blood cells, it increases, meaning we don't have a lot of oxygen being transported. If oxygen levels go up in the blood, then we decrease the production. And then finally here about the breakdown. So whenever the red blood cells are done, again, those macrophages are going to take up that hemoglobin that gets released whenever the red blood cell breaks down. That globin part is going to be broken down into amino acids, and then we have like our protein metabolism. The heme group, though, it's broken down to release the iron, and then the non-iron part of that's converted to what's called the biliverdin. And then to that bilirubin. So we mentioned bilirubin being found in the blood. It's from the breakdown of that heme. Then that free bilirubin joins to form conjugated bilirubin, ultimately gets added to bile and then passes through the feces to allow the breakdown of those red blood cells.